The forest of my thoughts was shrouded in mist that day, and I didn't even realize it until everything began to clear. But before I unravel this tale, let me introduce myself. My name is Frank, and today I'll share with you a story I've held close for far too long, a confession that has shaped my life in ways I never expected. If you find this story compelling, please leave a comment or subscribe. If not, let me know so I can keep improving. Back in my school days, I wasn't what anyone would call a model student. You wouldn't find me sitting in the front row with my hand raised, eager to answer questions. No, I was the class clown, the one who could get the whole room laughing with a single joke, often at the expense of my grades and my teacher's patience. The classroom wasn't a space where I thrived academically. Instead, it became my stage. My father often tried to steer me toward a more serious path. "Frank, you can't keep this up forever," he'd say sternly after another round of disappointing report cards. "Your future is on the line." But his words felt like static to me. My mind was elsewhere, on music, on hip-hop, on the dreams of a life far removed from math equations and geography lessons. At school, my antics were legendary. I mimicked teachers, cracked jokes, and orchestrated harmless pranks that left my classmates in stitches. I was particularly proud of my impression of Mrs. Hall, our algebra teacher, who had a habit of pushing her glasses up her nose mid-sentence. I could mimic her to perfection, down to the exact pitch of her voice, and my classmates loved it. But beneath the laughter, something else simmered, an emptiness I didn't fully understand. My humor wasn't just a distraction for others, it was a shield for myself, a way to mask my insecurities and my lack of connection to the material I was supposed to be learning. And then there was Mrs. Bloom. From the moment she stepped into the classroom, she was different. She carried herself with an air of quiet authority, her sharp eyes scanning the room as though she could see straight into our souls. She wasn't loud or imposing, but she had a presence that commanded attention. When she introduced herself as our new geography teacher, her voice was calm, steady, and confident. She wasn't like the other teachers who tried too hard to assert their dominance. Mrs. Bloom didn't need to try. Her effortless elegance and understated charm made her impossible to ignore. Her tailored blouse and skirt were professional yet undeniably stylish, and her quiet charisma filled the room. Naturally, I saw her as a challenge. It was in my nature to test authority, and I threw out my usual quips and jokes, expecting the same flustered reaction I got from most teachers. But Mrs. Bloom didn't falter. Instead, she met my antics with a calm, measured gaze, her lips curving into a subtle, knowing smile. She had this way of addressing me directly, not with frustration, but with an almost unnerving sense of understanding. "Is that the best you've got, Frank?" she'd say lightly, her tone as steady as her gaze. It wasn't a reprimand. It was a dare. And for the first time, I felt seen not as a troublemaker, but as someone with potential, buried beneath the layers of humor and bravado. Weeks went by, and I found myself paying more attention to her than I intended. Her laughter, soft and rare, seemed to light up the room. The way she explained even the driest topics made them feel relevant, almost intriguing. I caught myself watching her as she wrote on the board, her movements fluid and purposeful. It was during one of those ordinary days that everything shifted. We were in the middle of a geography lesson about tectonic plates, at least, I think that's what it was. I wasn't really paying attention to the material. My gaze drifted, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. It was only a second, but it felt like the world paused. The chatter of my classmates faded, the hum of the ceiling fan dulled, and all I could see was her. That fleeting moment left me shaken, though I didn't fully understand why. Things came to a head one Monday afternoon when my antics finally landed me in detention, again. But this time, Mrs. Bloom was in charge. I expected the usual scolding or a long, silent hour spent staring at the clock, but Mrs. Bloom had other plans. When I entered the empty classroom, the overhead lights cast a dim, almost eerie glow. Mrs. Bloom sat at her desk, grading papers with her usual composure. Without a word, she handed me a thick packet of geography problems. "This should keep you occupied," she said, her tone even but firm. The assignment was daunting, far more complex than anything I had tackled in class. The other students who trickled in for detention finished their tasks quickly and left, one by one, until it was just the two of us. I struggled to focus, the words on the page blurring together in a mess of confusion. Mrs. Bloom, noticing my frustration, finally approached my desk. Pulling up a chair, she sat beside me and leaned in. Having trouble? She asked, her voice gentle but direct. I nodded, feeling an unusual vulnerability in her presence. Instead of criticizing me, she began explaining the problem step by step, her tone patient and clear. For the first time, the material started to make sense. But it wasn't just her words that captivated me, it was the way she stayed, her attention unwavering. The room grew quieter as the school emptied out, and the space between us seemed to shrink. Her perfume, subtle and floral, lingered in the air, and the soft light caught the strands of her hair as she leaned closer. I didn't understand what I was feeling, a mix of admiration, gratitude, and something I couldn't quite name. But one thing was certain, Mrs. Bloom was no ordinary teacher. That moment in the silent classroom, with her sitting beside me, changed everything. It was as though the walls of my carefully constructed persona had been cracked open, and I was left exposed to a depth of emotion I wasn't prepared for. And that was only the beginning. The classroom was cloaked in silence, an unusual stillness settling over the room as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the windows. Mrs. Bloom leaned closer, her voice steady yet warm as she guided me through the complexities of the assignment. Her explanations were clear, her tone encouraging, but my mind was a tempest of thoughts, unable to fully focus. The faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air, subtle but captivating, a quiet reminder of her presence. As she leaned over the desk to point out an error, her hand brushed mine briefly, a fleeting moment, barely noticeable, yet it sent an inexplicable jolt through me. I froze, unsure of how to interpret the feeling, dismissing it as nothing more than my imagination. "You're overthinking this part," she said, her finger tracing the problem on the page. "Take it step by step." I nodded, trying to anchor myself in her words, but my thoughts continued to wander. There was something about her, an aura that commanded my attention in ways I couldn't explain. It wasn't just her intellect or her confidence, it was the way she seemed to see right through me, past the facade of the class clown I'd carefully constructed. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The dim glow of the overhead lights bathed the room in a muted warmth, and the hum of the building around us grew fainter with each passing moment. The world outside felt distant, leaving just the two of us in a bubble of quiet concentration. "Does this make sense now?" she asked, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that felt almost magnetic. "Yeah," I said softly, though my voice betrayed my inner turmoil. "It's starting to." She smiled, a genuine expression of encouragement that made my chest tighten. For a moment, the weight of my insecurities seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of connection I hadn't expected. As we continued working, I found myself noticing the small details, the way her hair caught the light, the precision of her movements, the warmth in her voice. It wasn't just admiration, it was something deeper, something unsettling yet strangely comforting. At one point, she leaned back slightly, her gaze lingering on me with an expression I couldn't decipher. "You're capable of so much more than you think, Frank," she said quietly. "You just need to believe it." Her words hung in the air, resonating in a way I hadn't anticipated. No teacher had ever spoken to me like that, not with such genuine faith in my potential. For the first time, I felt seen, truly seen, and it was both exhilarating and terrifying. The clock ticked on, the room growing darker as the evening settled in. I was acutely aware of how close she was, the space between us feeling smaller with each passing second. But then, a sound shattered the fragile stillness, footsteps echoing faintly in the hallway. Mrs. Bloom straightened immediately, her composed demeanor returning as she glanced toward the door. I followed her gaze, my heart pounding in my chest. "It's probably just the janitor," she said, her voice calm but edged with caution. "We should wrap this up." I nodded, hastily gathering my papers and stuffing them into my bag. The moment, whatever it had been, dissolved as reality came rushing back. As we left the classroom, the cool evening air greeted us, sharp and refreshing after the stifling quiet of the room. We walked in silence down the empty corridor, the tension between us lingering like an unfinished thought. "Thank you for staying late to help," I said finally, breaking the silence. She glanced at me, her expression softening. "You're welcome, Frank. Don't hesitate to ask if you ever need help again." I nodded, offering a small smile before heading toward the parking lot. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, not just in how I saw her, but in how I saw myself. Over the following days, I threw myself into my studies with a newfound determination. Mrs. Bloom's words echoed in my mind, pushing me to prove her right. Yet, despite my efforts to focus, I found myself replaying our moments together, searching for meaning in the smallest details. At night, as I lay in bed, my thoughts drifted to her, the way she carried herself, the kindness in her voice, the quiet strength she exuded. I tried to dismiss it as a harmless admiration, a fleeting infatuation that would pass with time. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Our interactions in class became tinged with an unspoken awareness. Her encouragement felt more personal, her glances lingered a fraction longer, and I found myself hanging on her every word. The dynamic between us was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but to me, it was a constant undercurrent, shaping my days in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. One afternoon, as I lingered after class to ask a question, she paused, her expression unreadable. "You've been working hard lately," she said, her voice carrying a note of pride. "It's good to see." "Thanks," I replied, feeling a warmth spread through me at her acknowledgement. "I'm just trying to do better." Her smile was faint but genuine. "You are," she said simply. As I left the room, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions: gratitude, admiration, and something more profound that I couldn't quite name. In the weeks that followed, I continued to excel in her class, driven by a desire to live up to her belief in me. But the line between teacher and student, between admiration and something deeper, remained clear in my mind. I knew that whatever I felt had to remain unspoken, a quiet acknowledgement of the impact she had on my life. Eventually, the semester came to an end, and Mrs. Bloom's time at our school was over. On her last day, she handed me my final paper, a small note tucked inside. "Frank," it read, "never stop pushing yourself. You're capable of greatness, believe in it." I kept that note, folding it carefully and tucking it into my wallet. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a reminder of a moment in my life when someone saw potential in me that I hadn't yet discovered in myself. Years later, as I reflected on those days, I realized that what I had felt wasn't just about her, it was about the way she had inspired me to see myself differently. Mrs. Bloom had been more than a teacher, she had been a catalyst, igniting a spark that would shape my future in ways I couldn't have imagined. And though our paths diverged, the lessons she taught me, both in and out of the classroom, remained with me, a quiet but enduring part of who I had become.